The Harlem Renaissance was one of the most influential and impactful movements of African American history, which paved the way for a rebirth of African American culture and spirit. However, my main concern of this topic focuses on how did the Harlem Renaissance give African Americans a voice in a racially oppressive society. As early as 1865, Jim Crow immediately followed the new installment of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. In 1877, Jim Crow laws were established in southern and border states, which segregated and limited African Americans from receiving equal rights as white people. Jim Crow included black codes, which dictated black citizens of the South into how they lived, where they lived, voting rights, and how they traveled. This was all in efforts to control and dehumanize African Americans from gaining true independence and individuality from the system that enslaved and abused African American identity. The most ruthless organization of the Jim Crow era, the Ku Klux Klan, was born in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, as a private club for Confederate veterans. The KKK terrorized the black community by violating their schools, burning their homes, performing lynchings, supporting Jim Crow laws, and encouraging extreme oppressive laws against African American citizens. As the South became a more discriminatory environment for African Americans to live, this naturally encouraged the Great Migration that took place from 1910 to 1970, where 6 million blacks left the South. The migration consisted of Southern blacks moving to northern cities in efforts to flee the KKK, Jim Crow laws, and held hope for new jobs and a safer life. The Harlem Renaissance, spanning from the 1920s to the 1930s, also known as the rebirth of blackness, the Harlem Renaissance was described as a spiritual coming of age in which African Americans transformed social disillusionment to race pride. Centered in Harlem, Manhattan, New York City, notably Harlem, New York, became famous for the revolutionary turnout that was born from black culture and musical enlightenment. It was a period where African Americans had risen in society through dance, music, art, spirituality, literature, culture, theater, and politics. Black artists exercised creative arts in all forms to express their evolution as a culture. Some of the greatest musical pieces born during the Harlem Renaissance allowed the spirit of the movement to flourish. With these areas being predominantly occupied by black citizens, allowed for a true sense of community to be born. Music was a huge influential factor of the Harlem Renaissance that produced new rhythms and sounds, making it more notably as the jazz era. African Americans were able to express themselves through the art of music, which reflected the journey of African American culture. Famous musical artists included Louis Armstrong, Count Bass, Billie Holiday, Eubie Blake, Duke Ellington, and Dorothy Dandridge. The Harlem Renaissance produced a lot of rich visual art which paved the way for new and fascinating artists. Art was a huge part of how the African Americans were able to express themselves and the hurt that they have felt as a collective whole in society. Some famous visual artists included Charles Austin, Henry Bernard, Buford Delaney, and Aaron Douglas. Two examples of powerful artwork included Charles Henry Austin, born 1907, used abstract expressionism, which is a diverse style emphasizing an artist's liberty to convey attitudes and emotions through non-traditional and usually non-representative means. He used a very contemporary source of art form to send his messages in diverse art forms. Aaron Douglas, born in 1899, known as the father of African American art, was known for using social realism to convey racial segregation and discrimination through his artwork. One of his most famous pieces, called Let My People Go, published in 1935, represented a biblical scene where Moses is called upon by God to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. This famous piece was a symbol of the unstable times and hardships African Americans faced and were currently facing under the scrutiny of society that placed a barrier from them to seek true freedom, with the emphasis of the title, Let My People Go. His depiction expressed a long-standing African American religious tradition that connected the oppression of the Israelites to the oppression of African Americans, as black spiritualites referring to biblical stories were one of the few ways that slaves could safely express their longing for freedom.
Turn into something. I'm mistaken. Here comes something now.
Dance was another form of expression that was present during the Harlem Renaissance. One famous groove in particular was the Lindy Hop, which grew in popularity, which evolved into many forms, such as West Coast swing, rock and roll, boogie woogie, the jitterbug, jive, bop, shag, bulba, and the impartial. Lindy Hop dancers created new steps as the music inspired them, just as jazz musicians would improvise. Literature was another creative aspect that was flourishing at this time period. Many incredible African American authors took flight in presenting precious and classical work to society, which was another way to voice against the unjust laws and morals that existed during this time period. Some famous authors included Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, and Countine Cullen. Langston Hughes, one of the most influential writers during this time period, wrote the poem The Negro Speaks of Rivers, published in 1920. The poem comments on pride, heritage, and nature. The poet's comments about the origin and historical existence of the African race. Literature was a passive window for African Americans to use their written voices to the fullest extent, to express the day-to-day oppression that existed in society. Literature offered new perspectives to people all over the world, but writers at the time were contributing to something very special.
Find somebody new. You're nobody's fashion plate, that you do agree. You know I like my fashion plate, so why don't you let me be?
So when identifying how the Harlem Renaissance gave African Americans a voice in an oppressive society, these artistic freedoms helped transform and progress society in the direction of hope for Americans to welcome a new surge of culture. The Harlem Renaissance showed how marginalized groups can soar in society through a creative lens that allows for an enlightening movement of rebirth. All these different artistic expressions, born from all the hurt, anger, and silent suffering the Black community faced, were used to cultivate and express their emotions through the creative arts as a powerful tool to redefine their cultural identity and strengthen their belongingness as one. By using the creative arts, the Harlem Renaissance not only boomed in culture and innovation, but African Americans used creativity in all facets in efforts to use their voices to rise above oppressiveness and show strength through adversity.